Hi, my name is Rick Honnenberg, and I want to introduce you to Jule Klotter. She's a medical writer and editor of Townsend Letter. It's a publication that focuses on integrative and alternative medicines. And she began making sauerkraut some years ago after reading the book Wild Fermentation, and has been experimenting with fermentation ever since. Jule, I'll let you take over now.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, well, let's start, if this works. How does... Thank you. High tech. Okay, before we had any of the processed foods, the refrigerators, the chemical preservatives, this is how people would save food for later that they've harvested. You may be familiar with many of these: sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, and I'm not talking about the sauerkraut that's in the can on the shelf. I'm talking about the sauerkraut that you find in the cooler section. Same thing with the kimchi, the pickles, sourdough breads, the real sourdough breads that don't have preservatives, miso, tempeh, kombucha, yogurt, kefir, cheeses, sour cream, vinegar, wine. All of those are fermented foods. You may have seen some of these in the store. I know the food co-op down the street has several of these. Ingalls carries some of them too. The food co-op actually has the kombucha. Is that my pointer? Yeah. This here is kombucha. Food co-op has different kinds of sauerkraut and kimchi. There's a daikon radish kimchi here. So you can buy these things. You don't have to make them. But often when you're trying to buy them, they're pretty expensive. And they're really easy to make.
What's kombucha?
We'll talk about that. You're going to like this one, Rick. Any fresh food can be fermented. There's two kinds. There's wild fermentation, and that uses the natural occurring bacteria that is on the foods, the fresh food, and in the air. So for example, if you start out with the Korean cabbage, then the little bacteria will ferment it and turn it into kimchi. Of course, kimchi also has peppers and other good spicy things with it. Same thing here for sourdough starter. I don't know if anybody's tried that before, but all you have to do, you've done it. Yeah, I mean, you have a grain, you add water, you put it in the right temperature, let it sit, and all of a sudden it starts bubbling. And the bubbling are the yeasts and the bacteria. So then you get your sourdough starter. Now, instead of the wild fermented, which you just use what's in the air, some fermented foods need a starter. So if you actually want to make bread, you have your flour plus the starter to make the bread. Yogurt, same idea. You start out with your milk. You either need yogurt that's organic, has live bacteria in it. That's your starter. And then you use heat to make the yogurt. Instead of buying yogurt as starter, you can also buy packets of the bacteria, all packaged up for you. There's your kombucha. Kombucha is a traditional drink. I've heard that it came from Russia. I've heard it came from China. All I know is you start out with the black tea, have some sugar, have some water, and then you have this awful looking thing called a SCOBY. And it's basically, it looks like a pancake. It's a biofilm colony of bacteria and yeasts. And together, they make this kind of tangy, sweet drink that I really like. I'm kind of addicted. It's pretty expensive. It's like something like $3 a bottle if you get one. But it's very lots of enzymes, different good, not nutrients like vitamin B or something, but it's the kind of stuff that your gut goes, oh man, this is real food. You can make, I have not tried this, I have fermented the garlic that I grew, because if you've ever grown garlic and you grow a lot of it, by spring it's all sprouting and you can't use it anymore. But you can either ferment it using kefir grains, or you can just put it in a brine of water. It'll last for a year, and you can still cook with it. Benefits of fermented foods. Well, why eat them? One is that they're full of enzymes, and the enzymes actually help your body digest the food and get more nutrition from it. They're the probiotics, the bacteria that are in them. How many of you are familiar with probiotics? You know what I'm talking about? Okay. That's gotten to be the new thing now. You can go to the store and buy a bottle of probiotics, but they usually only have a few strains in them, whereas the foods can have many different strains. And all of these bacteria live in a very ecological colony within your body and all have different purposes. The other good thing about fermenting is that the lactic acid that's created during fermentation will kill the E. coli. They're having an E. coli scare right now about romaine lettuce. If it were fermented, you would not have to worry about that because the lactic acid will get rid of it. Those bacteria just can't live in that acidic environment. The other thing is the preservation, like I was saying with the garlic. I can have garlic for over a year now that it's fermented. And the nutrition. Amazingly, some of these little bacteria actually make more vitamins in the process of fermenting the food. So it actually ends up being a richer food for you. Living bacteria under the right conditions preserve raw vegetables and increase their nutrition. What you're looking for is good bacteria. On our skin, in our nose, in our ears, in our guts, we have all these little microbes, and they live in harmony. And the good ones give us health. And if there's enough of them, they can keep any of the bad guys from overtaking and making us sick. There are foods that make beneficial bacteria happy. And what I want to say about that is one of the things that has changed in our culture, because we have so many processed foods, we have artificial foods and flavorings, it actually has changed the composition of our guts, the microbes in our guts, so that we don't have some of the immune protection that people who eat real food, live food, do. If you eat certain food sources, these are called prebiotics. That is a food source for the beneficial bacteria in your gut. When I first started learning about the microbiota, it just blew my mind. There are more bacteria in our GI tracts than there are cells in our bodies. They weigh up to a couple pounds. I mean, the number of species that they have, it's unbelievable, the diversity of a healthy gut. I like that one up there. In our body, microbes outnumber our cells 10 to 1. They just started investigating the microbes in our gut. Well, maybe the last 15 years, they've started trying to track them. And we are just beginning to realize all the consequences that they have for us. They are a key part of the immune system. They keep the pathogens from taking over. They make vitamins like vitamin C. Some of them make the serotonin for your brain. They help you digest your food. And the lactobacillus, it's like in the yogurt and that, if that isn't there, the lining of the intestines actually starts becoming permeable, which allows the bad bacteria to get into the bloodstream. So, we want happy ones, and we want a lot of different ones, which is a benefit of fermentation. They have found links between all of these, especially things like eczema, allergies, inflammatory bowel. Every single one of these conditions, they've found a link between the kind of microbes in the gut and these diseases. Okay, 1,000 different bacterial species and 124 Europeans. That's not to say that they have the same, but that's 1,000 different ones. And they haven't even begun looking at the fungi and the yeasts and all these other microbes, just these. What is fascinating, and this is where the Earth Day stuff comes in for me, is that they've done studies, and people who live in natural areas where there's more types of microbes, they have more different bacterial species in their GI tracts. Whoop. And what gets rid of the diversity? Well, in the environment, it's urbanization, it's plowing, and it's the chemicals they use on the land. In people, it's synthetic foods, preservatives, antibiotics. When I go to the vet now, my dog needs an antibiotic. She always gives a probiotic along with it, because any of those things will kill the bacteria indiscriminately. And one of the other things I found out about, this is really my day to talk about the bacteria because they're such a big part of this. Apparently what happens is the roots on plants will send out a certain kind of sugar. It attracts a certain kind of bacteria that they need to grow and develop. So if they need a bacteria that, say, contains boron, it'll put out one sugar. These bacteria will come and help the plant digest its nutrients. That's just a pretty picture. So is it safe? Now we're getting to, that was all the background. Now we're getting into how to do it. Is it safe? Yes. If you follow very simple rules on how to ferment food, you will end up creating something that the negative bacteria cannot live in. And on top of that, you will have something that's more nutritious, and it's very easy to tell if it isn't something you want to eat, because it'll stink or it'll look awful. So if you end up with something that you fermented and you open up the jar and you're going, just compost it. Or if it's I've never had one that actually had mold growing on it. If you do it right, you don't usually have that problem. So how to encourage the bacteria? Because they're our buddies. The first thing you want to do is to have good produce. Anything that's on the produce is going to end up in your product. You don't want something that looks like it's already rotting, because that means the bacteria have already gotten to it. And you don't necessarily want to be culturing or having them grow in your jar. So you want something that looks good, fresh vegetables. You need water that doesn't have chlorine, because why do we put chlorine in water? It's so we don't grow bacteria. But in fermentation, you're trying to grow the bacteria, right? So you need a good source of water. You can use spring, you can use filtered, you could probably use distilled. You want it room temperature because they're a little fussy. They don't grow in cold. And when we get to it, when you fill it up, I'm bad at this. I usually fill it up to here, and I always have it because the gases will expand and there's more water coming out of the top, so I have a saucer underneath. But if you can actually just fill it to here, then you don't have to worry about the excess coming out. Second thing after the water and good produce is salt. And I use unrefined sea salt. I tried canning salt, and the salt is just too harsh. It makes the ferment taste really, really salty to me. You don't want to use iodized because, again, what does iodine do? It kills off bacteria. Now, the good thing about the salt is, one is it'll pull the moisture from the vegetables. And so that in itself, that moisture is part of what you can use in your ferments. Otherwise, you need to make sure that the vegetables are covered by water. Also, the salt will make the vegetables crunchier. And that salt will discourage the growth of bacteria other than the lactobacillus. The lactobacilli are salt tolerant. Okay? And I can't emphasize this. Make sure your containers are clean. Don't use metal because the salt and the acid that's forming will start breaking down the metal. I have found, people buy $100 crocks that the old Germans used to do, and that's fine. You can do that. But wide mouth canning jars, you can't beat them. They work great. And that way you can, make it as big or as small as you want. You can also use these, but like I say, the canning jars work good. The reason I say wide mouth, I'm going to go away. When you put your vegetables in here, you want to pack them down. And if you get like a meat pounder or something like that, you can get it into the wide mouth jar, whereas the narrow mouth ones you can't. That's why you want to go wide. That's the biggest thing to know. As long as your vegetables are covered by the water or brine that you use, you're in good shape. It won't mold. It'll just ferment. Okay, now in the summer it gets a little tricky down here. Usually I make my sauerkraut in the spring and in the fall because when it's 85 in the house, it'll ferment quick. And so consequently you want to probably, if it's too warm, like I say, it's going to kill the microbes or it's going to encourage mold. You can do it, just don't what I would do when I do it in the summer is I don't leave it sitting on the counter very long. I'll maybe do a day or two, and then I put it in the fridge. Like it says, warm place, 3 to 5 days. If it's cooler in your house, maybe a little bit, towards the 5. And once it's in the fridge, it'll keep fermenting because it doesn't kill the bacteria, but they just start working a lot slower. Okay, here's the steps. Anybody make sauerkraut here before? Folks, this is so easy, and I like to experiment, but I'm, not a big deal. Go find a head of cabbage. I slice it, usually I quarter it, I core out the quarter, and then I just do exactly what they do up here. You shred it. Now, you can do more than cabbage. You can put shredded carrot in there. You could do very sliced onion in there. You could put maybe a little garlic. I made a sauerkraut last year where I grated turnip. And let's say I had daikon radish. Kimchi, the same idea. You're doing the shredding, and you're just making everything fine. And then you pound it. Because you're trying, and usually first I'll put a tablespoon of salt in there because that'll draw out the liquid. You pound it. You're trying to break down the cellulose of the vegetables. And then when you're getting some liquid out of it too, and then you can put it in your jar. But because you want to make sure that it's covered with liquid, this is where I pound it down in my jar. And if it's not covered with liquid, then I add brine. And all that is water with some salt in it, so that I can make sure that it's covered totally with liquid. So usually I'll have 2 cups of water and put a tablespoon of salt in that water. And if I need extra liquid to make sure the vegetables are covered, that's what goes in there. Now, some people, and I found this picture and I went, I don't mind, instead of pounding it using my hands, but for God's sakes, take your jewelry off. You want to make sure your hands are clean, but you can feel the difference in the vegetable. It'll start getting limp, and that's what you want. You can pound it, you can use your hands, but make sure they're clean and there's nothing holding other critters in there for you. And when it's done, it'll look really pretty, whatever colors you've got in there. But notice, you can probably see a little bit, every single one of these, the water should be above the vegetables. Now that can get a little tricky because sometimes these things will float. So there's a couple ways to do that. When you're making the sauerkraut, you'll always have the outside leaves that you don't necessarily want to cut up, but they're nice and stiff. And so once I pack my vegetables in there, I will actually take some of the leaf, and my water's there, my vegetables are good, and I'll put the leaf in the top. And if you happen to have a little glass thing, and it holds the weight down, so it'll actually hold the vegetables under the water, which is what you want to do.
What if some vegetables are sticking out? What happens?
They might mold. They may look discolored because they didn't get enough fermentation.
Will it spoil the rest?
No. I've only had one batch that I opened, I went, oh my gosh. And it was because I had taken a fork and scooped out something out of one bottle, and I used the same fork in the other. It's kind of like being back in chemistry lab, not chemistry, but biology lab. You're trying not to mix your cultures. But like I say, you could tell because I opened it up, I went, okay. See, this is what they do with the crocks, and there's other ways to do this. Some people, they'll use little baggies, fill it with water, and put it in the top. I don't like to use the plastic, but, just some kind of weight to make sure that the vegetables are down. In these big crocks, you can use plates and set a plate in there and have something on top. This is my very favorite, and for those who do not like sauerkraut, this is a great recipe. It's cabbage, cup of grated carrot, it's an onion, and you slice it fine, oregano, pepper flakes, because any of these, you can add your own spices. It's not just the salt, you can add other things. This is another thing that's easy to make. You take some organic beets, peel them, chop them up. Now this says optional whey. You can get that by getting it from yogurt and letting it drain. The liquid is the whey. You don't need to do that. I just make it with sea salt. So in a half-gallon jar, I have a tablespoon of sea salt, put in my vegetables, let it sit on the counter a couple days, put it in the fridge. And it may take a little bit longer for it to ferment. I think this last batch, it wasn't that warm in the house, but by the time a week was done, it's not sweet like beet juice. If you ever had beet juice, it's like hard for me to eat. But it's a great way to do beets, okay? And those are good online resources. The library has wild fermentation. And this is another library book that's excellent. And then this is the one that introduced me to fermenting foods. So let me think. After I started doing fermentation, I started going, and the gourmet people online are going, oh, you've got to try one of these. This keeps all the oxygen in it, and it makes them crunchier and everything. And basically, it becomes a closed system. I have them. I would not bother. They're very expensive for the plastic that they have. The tops that you use with the regular canning jars work great. Thank you all very much.
Good job, everybody.